tightly around his neck. Of course it was impossible that the accommodation carried a fare for him, but then duty was duty, and Spike took exceeding pride in the company for which he worked. The company's slogan of service was part of Spike's creed. He opened the door, recoiled for a second as the gale swept angrily against him, then plunged blindly across the street. He clambered into the seat of his cab, depressed the starter, and eventually was answered by the reluctant cough of the motor. He raced it for a while, getting the machinery heated up preparatory to the possibility of a run. Then he saw the big doors at the main entrance of the station open and a few melancholy passengers, brought to town by the accommodation train, step to the curb, glance about in search of a street car, and then duck back into the station. Spike shoved his clutch in and crawled forward along the curb, leaving the inky shadows of the far end of the station, and emerging finally into the effulgence of the arc at the corner of Cypress Street. Once again the door of the Union Station opened. This time Spike took a professional interest in the person who stepped uncertainly out into the night. Long experience informed him that this was a fare. She was of medium height, and comfortably guarded against the frigidity of the night by a long fur coat buttoned snugly around her neck. She wore a small squirrel tam, and was heavily veiled. In her right hand she carried a large suitcase and in her left a purse. She stepped to the curb and looked around inquiringly. She signaled the cab. Even as he speeded his car forward, Spike wondered at her indifference to the almost unbearable cold. "Cab, miss?" He pulled up short before her. "Yes." Her tone was almost curt. She had her hand on the door handle before Spike could make a move to alight. "Drive to 981 East End Avenue." Without leaving the driver's seat, Spike reached for her suitcase and put it beside him. The woman, a young woman, Spike reflected, stepped inside and slammed the door. Spike fed the gas and started, whirling south on Atlantic Avenue for 2 blocks, and then turning to his left across the long viaduct which marks the beginning of East End Avenue. He settled himself for a long and unpleasant drive. To reach 981 East End Avenue he had to drive nearly 5 miles straight in the face of the December gale. And then he found himself wondering about the woman. Her coat, a rich fur thing of black and gray, her handbag, her whole demeanor, all bespoke affluence. She had probably been visiting at some little town, and had come down on the accommodation, but no one had been there to meet her. Anyway, Spike found himself too miserable and too cold to reflect much about his passenger. He drove into a head wind. The sleet slapped viciously against his windshield and stuck there. The patent device he carried for the purpose of cleaning rain away refused to work. Spike shoved his windshield up in order to afford a vision of the icy asphalt ahead. And then he grew cold in earnest. He seemed to freeze all the way through. He drove mechanically, becoming almost numb as the wind, unimpeded now, struck him squarely. He lost all interest in what he was doing or where he was going. He called himself a fool for having left the cozy warmth of the White Star Café. He told himself. Suddenly he clamped on the brakes. It was a narrow squeak. The end of the long freight train rumbled on into the night. Spike hadn't seen it. Only the racket of the big cars as they crossed East End Avenue, and then the lights on the rear of the caboose, had warned him. He stopped his car for perhaps 15 seconds to make sure that the crossing was clear, then started on again, a bit shaken by the narrow escape. He bumped cautiously across the railroad tracks. The rest of the journey was a nightmare. The suburb through which he was passing seemed to have congealed. Save for the corner lights, there was no sign of life. The roofs and sidewalks glistened with ice. Occasionally the car struck a bump and skidded dangerously. Spike had forgotten his passenger, forgotten the restaurant, the coffee, the weather itself. He only remembered that he was cold, almost unbearably cold. Then he began taking note of the houses. There was number 916. He looked ahead. These were houses of the poorer type, the homes of laborers situated on the outer edge of the suburb of East End. Funny, the handsomely dressed woman, such a poor neighborhood. He came to a halt before a dilapidated bungalow which squatted darkly in the night. Stiff with cold, he reached his hand back to the door on the right of the car, and with difficulty opened it. Then he spoke. "Here you are, miss, number 981." There was no answer. Spike repeated, "Here you are, miss." Still no answer. Spike clambered stiffly from the car, circled to the curb, and stuck his head in the door. "Here, miss." Spike stepped back. Then he again put his head inside the cab. "Well, I'll be!" The thing was impossible, and yet it was true. Spike gazed at the seat. The woman had disappeared. The thing was absurd, impossible. He had seen her get into the cab at the Union Station. There, in the front of the car, was her suit case. But she had gone, disappeared completely, vanished without leaving a sign. Momentarily forgetful of the cold, Spike found a match and lighted it. Holding it cupped in his hands, he peered within the cab. Then he recoiled with a cry of horror. For huddled on the floor, he discerned the body of a man. End of chapter 1. Recording by Roger Moline.